What if your deepest desires were exposed, in the worst possible way? What would you do if the person who found out was someone you never expected, someone you had no choice but to face every single day? Welcome to Sly Infidelity Stories, where secrets, passion, and forbidden desires come alive. This is your ultimate destination for thrilling tales of love, betrayal, and seduction that you won't find anywhere else. If you love stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your fellow story lovers. Your support keeps these tales coming. It happened to me. I didn't plan it, didn't see it coming. But there I was, caught in a moment so intense, so private, and there was no way out. You see, I didn't think anyone would find out. Not like this. But there he was, standing in the doorway, watching me. My stepson. His eyes wide, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted him to see. But something inside me didn't feel the rush of panic I thought I would. Instead, I felt something else. Something I couldn't explain. It's hard to explain, but everything changed after that night. I'm sure you're wondering how I got here. How did I end up in a situation where my own stepson caught me? Well, let me tell you. I'm Sarah. I'm in my early 30s, and I've been married to Paul for about 4 years now. Paul is a great guy, steady, reliable, always there when you need him. He's the type of person who would drop everything to help a friend or family member. He's kind, loving, and just easy to be around. I've always felt like we had this deep connection. But if I'm being honest, there was always something missing. Now, my stepson, Jason, that's a different story. He's 19, Paul's son from a previous marriage, and he lives with us. He's the kind of guy who keeps to himself. Jason's quiet, a bit moody at times, but there's a sharpness about him. He has these dark, serious eyes that make it hard to read him. He doesn't talk much, but when he does, you can tell there's a lot going on in that head of his. At first, I didn't think much about it. He was just Paul's son. I treated him like any other teenager. We didn't talk much, but we didn't fight either. He would stay in his room, do his own thing, and I would go about my day, doing what I had to do around the house. But recently, things started to feel different. I noticed the way Jason would look at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It was subtle, but it was there. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was overthinking it. But I couldn't ignore the way he seemed to hover around the kitchen when I was making dinner, or the way his gaze would linger on me just a bit too long whenever we crossed paths. The tension was small at first, like a faint whisper in the back of my mind. But soon, it felt like something was shifting between us, something neither of us could quite understand. One evening, it all came to a head. It was just after dinner, and I was cleaning up in the kitchen. Paul had gone out with some friends for the night, and Jason was sitting on the couch, watching TV. I didn't think much of it. I grabbed a glass of water and started wiping down the counter when I noticed Jason standing behind me. I could feel him there, but I didn't turn around right away. I just felt his presence. When I finally did, there he was, his face inches away from mine. His eyes were so dark in the low light, like they were pulling me in. I could hear the faint beat of my heart, and I wondered if he could hear it too. "Hey, Jason," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice felt a little shaky. "What's up?" He just stood there for a moment, staring at me, and then said something I wasn't expecting. "You look beautiful when you're working around the house. Just thought you should know." His words hung in the air. Simple, but they hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just smiled awkwardly and looked away, busying myself with the dishes. But he didn't move. He stayed there, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body. I tried to ignore it. But the way he was looking at me, it was like he was seeing me in a way I wasn't used to. It wasn't just a glance. It was intense. I could almost feel his gaze touching every part of me. And then he spoke again. "You don't have to be nervous around me, you know. I'm not going to bite," Jason said, his voice low, smooth. I turned to face him. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't expecting that. His tone was teasing, but there was something deeper beneath it. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "I'm not nervous," I lied, but even I knew it wasn't true. Jason took a step closer, and I could feel his breath on my skin. "You don't have to hide," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know why, but I didn't pull away. I should have. I should have stepped back, told him to stop, but I didn't. I just stood there, frozen in the moment. There was something magnetic about him, something I couldn't explain. I'd never noticed it before, but now I can't ignore it. That was the moment. That was the moment everything shifted. From that point on, it was like the walls between us started to fade away. There was an undeniable connection in the air, and I couldn't figure out if it was something I wanted to explore or something I needed to avoid. But by the time I figured that out, it was already too late. And before I knew it, things took a turn neither of us expected. The next few days felt strange. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment in the kitchen, where Jason had stood so close to me. His words echoed in my mind. "You don't have to be nervous around me." I told myself I was overthinking things. I was just imagining stuff. After all, he was my stepson. He was just being, well, Jason. He had always been quiet, serious, and a little distant, so maybe he was just trying to be nice. Right? But that night after dinner, it happened again. Paul had gone out again, leaving me and Jason alone in the house. I tried to stay busy, cleaning up, picking up around the living room. I even made sure to keep the TV on so it would feel normal, like nothing was wrong. But I couldn't help feeling the pull between us, this tension that had started to build ever since that night in the kitchen. Jason was sitting on the couch, like usual, but he was staring at me, his eyes following my every move. I felt it again, that strange feeling in my chest, like I was being drawn to him. I kept my head down, focusing on the task in front of me, trying not to let my mind wander. But then, without warning, Jason stood up and walked over to me. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking as I wiped the same spot on the counter for the third time. "Sarah," Jason said, his voice softer than usual. "You don't have to keep cleaning. I'm sure everything's fine." I finally looked up at him, and I saw the same look in his eyes. The look that made my heart race and my palms sweat. He wasn't angry, wasn't upset, he was just watching me. "Jason, I'm just trying to stay busy. I don't want to just sit here and do nothing." It was a lie. I didn't want to be busy. I wanted to run away from the feeling he was making me have. But Jason didn't back off. Instead, he stepped closer and suddenly, I could smell his cologne. It wasn't strong, but it was there, close, almost too close. "I don't think you're busy," he said quietly. "I think you're avoiding something." His words hit me like a punch. I wasn't sure how to respond. Was he talking about the weird tension between us? Was he talking about the way I felt around him? Or was he just being Jason? I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, and I knew I was trapped in a situation I didn't know how to get out of. But somehow, part of me didn't want to escape. I didn't want to pull away from him. Not yet. Later that week, it happened again. It was a hot afternoon, and Paul was gone again, off with friends or running errands. I couldn't remember. Jason and I were both in the house, but it felt like there was this invisible wall between us. We were in the same space, but it was as if we were living in different worlds. I had been sitting on the couch, reading a book, when Jason walked in and sat down beside me. Not too close, but close enough for me to feel his presence. My heart started to race, and I found myself getting nervous for no reason at all. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, staring at the TV, while I tried to keep my focus on my book. I couldn't concentrate. I could feel his eyes on me, and it was making my skin tingle. I was so aware of him, of the way his body was just inches from mine. "So, how's the book?" Jason asked after a long silence. His voice was casual, but there was something in it that made me pause. "It's good," I said, my voice a little shaky. "Just a story about a girl who's trying to figure out her life." "Sounds complicated," he said, turning his head to look at me. His gaze was intense, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. I swallowed hard, feeling the tension rise again. I didn't know how to explain it, how to explain the strange pull I felt when I was around him. I could almost feel him waiting for me to say something. Anything. The days after that were full of the same kind of tension. Little things, like the way Jason would stand too close to me in the kitchen, or how his eyes would follow my every movement when we were in the same room. Sometimes, he'd make small comments that made my heart race, like, "I can't believe how beautiful you look today, Sarah," or "You always know how to make everything seem so easy." At first, I thought he was just being polite. But it wasn't just politeness. It was the way he said it. The way his voice softened, the way his eyes didn't just glance at me but stayed on me, like he was waiting for something. It was like he was looking for something in me, something I wasn't sure I wanted to show him. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when Jason walked in, looking more serious than usual. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, his hands shoved in his pockets, looking down at the floor. "Jason?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "What's going on?" He looked up at me then, and I could see a flicker of something in his eyes, something I couldn't explain. Something that made my stomach flip. "I'm not sure, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "But I think I might be feeling something different." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" Jason didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, like he was trying to figure out how to say what was on his mind. I could feel my own heart pounding in my chest, and I wanted to run, wanted to escape this growing tension. But I didn't. "I don't know what it is, but I feel something when I'm around you. And I think you feel it too." The words hung in the air between us, thick and heavy. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to say he was wrong. But instead, I just stood there, too scared to speak. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, replaying every moment between Jason and me. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew there was something between us, something unspoken, something neither of us knew how to handle. The next morning, I found myself avoiding him. Every time he entered the room, I quickly turned away, as if by doing so, I could ignore the tension in the air. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't escape it. It was there, always lingering just beneath the surface. And I couldn't decide if I was scared or curious. The next few days felt impossible to ignore. Every time I looked at Jason, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was changing between us. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. It wasn't just the way he looked at me. It was the way we both seemed to find ourselves in the same room at the same time, like we couldn't stay apart. Even though we didn't speak much, there was this silent tension between us. And I couldn't escape it. I didn't know if I wanted to escape it. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen making lunch. The house was quiet, too quiet. Paul was still at work, and Jason was in his room. I thought it would be a nice, peaceful afternoon. But when Jason came into the kitchen, it was like everything shifted again. He walked in like he always did, casual but with that certain look in his eyes that made me feel nervous. "Hey," he said, walking past me to the fridge. "What's for lunch?" I could barely focus on his words. I could only think about how close he was standing to me, how his presence seemed to fill the room. It was like I could feel every movement of his body, every breath he took. "Just sandwiches," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nothing fancy." He didn't say anything at first, but I could feel his gaze on me again. I felt it before I even turned around to face him. When I did, I found him standing right behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. His hand brushed mine as he reached for the bread, and for a split second, I thought I might faint. The simple touch made my pulse race. "Sorry," Jason said quickly, stepping back. But he didn't move far. He stayed just close enough that I could still feel the tension in the air, like something was about to happen. I turned back to the counter, trying to ignore the heat rising in my cheeks. "It's fine," I whispered, but I wasn't sure if it really was. Later that evening, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, but not really watching anything. My mind kept wandering, and I couldn't stop thinking about Jason. It was getting harder and harder to pretend like nothing was happening between us. Then, as if reading my mind, Jason walked into the living room. He didn't sit down at first. He just stood there, leaning against the doorframe, looking at me like he was deciding whether or not to say something. I couldn't help but feel my heart rate increase, just like every other time he got close. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. I nodded quickly, trying to act normal. "Yeah, just tired." But that was a lie. I wasn't tired. I was confused. I was overwhelmed by everything that had been happening between us, and I wasn't sure what to do about it. Jason didn't say anything right away. Instead, he walked over and sat down beside me on the couch. He sat closer than usual, just enough that I could feel his warmth beside me. He didn't say anything at first, but I could tell something was different. His body was facing me now, and he was watching me carefully, like he was waiting for me to say something. But I didn't know what to say. "Jason," I began, my voice shaking, "I don't know what's happening, but we need to figure this out." He leaned in just a little, his face so close to mine that I could feel his breath on my skin. "Maybe we don't need to figure it out just yet," he said softly. I could feel the space between us closing in. I knew what was coming, but I couldn't pull away. I didn't want to. Just as our faces were inches apart, the door opened, and Paul stepped inside. "Hey, I'm home," he called. The moment shattered like glass. Jason quickly pulled back, sitting up straight, and I immediately stood up. My heart was racing, my breath shaky, and I couldn't look at him. I couldn't look at anyone. I just needed to leave the room. "Hey, Paul," I said, forcing a smile. "How was your day?" It wasn't until later that I realized just how much I had wanted that moment to happen, how much I had wanted to kiss him, even though I knew it was wrong, even though I knew it couldn't happen. And yet, a part of me didn't care. The next few days felt like a blur. Everything seemed normal on the surface. Paul went to work, and Jason stayed in his room, doing his usual thing. But when we crossed paths, the tension was still there. Neither of us spoke about what had happened, but I could feel it lingering in the air, thick and undeniable. One afternoon, after a long day, I was sitting on the back porch, sipping on some lemonade. The weather was warm, and the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over everything. I needed a moment to breathe, to clear my head. But Jason came outside, holding a football. "Want to play catch?" he asked, throwing it lightly in my direction. I hesitated for a moment. Part of me wanted to say no, to avoid being alone with him. But another part of me wanted the chance to be close to him again, to feel that strange pull that had been growing between us. So, I stood up, tossing the lemonade aside. "Sure," I said. We spent the next few minutes tossing the ball back and forth, our movements awkward at first, but slowly becoming more natural. We laughed and joked, trying to avoid the uncomfortable silence that was always lingering between us. But the more we played, the more I couldn't help but notice how close we were getting. The way his hands brushed mine as he passed the ball. The way his smile made my heart flutter. Then, out of nowhere, Jason threw the ball too high, and it landed on the other side of the yard. I went to grab it, but when I bent down, I felt his hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a light touch. It was firm, like he was grounding me, pulling me in. "Sarah," Jason said, his voice low. "I can't stop thinking about what happened. I don't want to pretend like nothing's going on between us. I need you to know how I feel." I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. His words hung in the air, heavy and real. But before I could say anything, we heard a car pull into the driveway. It was Paul. The moment was lost again. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or disappointed. I wanted to scream. Why couldn't I just be honest with myself? Why couldn't I just admit what I was feeling? I quickly stood up, brushing the dirt off my clothes, and forced a smile when Paul walked toward us. "Hey, everything okay?" he asked, glancing between me and Jason. "Yeah," Jason said quickly. "Just playing around," but I could see the way Jason's eyes lingered on me. It was as if he wanted to say more, but he held back. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. That things between us couldn't stay like this forever. And that scared me. The next few days were filled with silence. But the tension was still there. It wasn't something I could ignore, no matter how hard I tried. Jason and I hadn't spoken about the moment in the backyard. We hadn't mentioned anything about the night he caught me. But every time we passed each other in the hallway, every time our eyes met across the room, I could feel it building again. Something was going to happen. Something I wasn't ready for. I've been thinking a lot about what happened between Jason and me. After everything that's happened, I find myself asking, what would you do if you were in my shoes? How do you deal with a situation like this? I've tried to act like nothing's different, but deep down, I know it's not the same. There's a tension between us that I can't explain. Every time Jason looks at me, I feel like I'm being pulled closer, even though I know I shouldn't want to be. I've told myself 100 times that it's wrong, that he's my stepson, and nothing can happen between us. But every time I'm near him, I feel like it's getting harder to pretend. What do you think I should do? Should I keep avoiding him and pretend nothing's going on? Or should I face the feelings I have and see where they lead? Would you be able to stay away from someone you feel so drawn to, or would you give in to what your heart tells you? I want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments, what do you think Sarah should do? Should she push Jason away, or should she allow herself to feel what she's feeling? I know I'm not the only one who's ever had a situation like this. If you've ever found yourself in a complicated or confusing moment where emotions are all over the place, I'm sure you've wondered what to do next. It's so easy to tell someone else what they should do, but when you're in the middle of it, everything feels so much more complicated. Let me know in the comments what you think of what's happening between Sarah and Jason. Is it just a misunderstanding, or is something real happening between them? And do you think Sarah should follow her heart or listen to the voice in her head that's telling her this is wrong? Also, if you're enjoying this story and want to hear more, make sure to hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, so you can follow along with the rest of Sarah's journey. We've got more twists and turns coming, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. I'm really curious to hear what you all think about where this story is going. What do you think will happen next? Will Sarah and Jason finally talk about everything they're feeling? Or will their emotions stay trapped inside, creating even more tension between them? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to like this video if you want more suspense, drama, and twists like this. And of course, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the crazy developments ahead. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The days passed in a haze, like I was walking through a fog I couldn't escape. It felt like I was constantly waiting for something to happen, for some moment where everything would finally make sense. But it never came. Each day felt like a replay of the last. Jason and I still had that same unspoken connection, but we never spoke about it. It was like an elephant in the room, one we both pretended wasn't there. One evening, after dinner, when Paul went to bed early, I found myself in the kitchen cleaning up. The sound of the dishes clinking against each other was oddly calming. I was wiping the counter when Jason walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, watching me. I glanced up and saw the way he was looking at me, like he was waiting for permission to speak, like he wasn't sure if he should break the silence. I wiped my hands on the towel, my heart pounding in my chest. "Jason, what's up?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, even though inside, everything was screaming. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what he might say, but I knew it was only a matter of time before we both had to face this. Jason started, then hesitated. "I've been thinking about what happened the other day with the everything." I stopped wiping the counter. My hands were shaking, but I didn't let it show. This was the moment. I could feel it. The air was thick with anticipation. "You don't have to say anything," I said quickly, my voice trembling slightly. "We don't have to talk about it." Jason stepped forward, closer than I expected. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke again. "No, I want to. I need to. Because I can't stop thinking about you, Sarah. I've tried, but I can't. It's like everything's changed, and I don't know how to handle it." His words hung in the air, heavy and raw. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him to stop, to tell him it was wrong, that we couldn't do this. But a part of me didn't want him to stop. A part of me wanted him to keep talking, to keep saying all the things I was too scared to admit. "I don't know what to do either," I said quietly, looking down at the floor. It feels wrong, Jason. You're my stepson. I shouldn't be feeling like this." There was silence between us for a long moment. It was like the whole world had paused. The kitchen light flickered overhead, casting shadows on the walls. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. I was afraid of what I might see in his eyes, afraid of what it might make me feel. But then Jason spoke again, his voice so soft, it almost sounded like he was speaking to himself. "I don't care," he said, his words barely audible. "I don't care if it's wrong. I just know that I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want to hide how I feel." I wanted to say something, to tell him that it wasn't that simple, that we couldn't just ignore the consequences. But when I looked up, his eyes were filled with something I couldn't name, something deep and unspoken. And I realized I didn't know what to do either. Part of me wanted to pull away, but part of me didn't. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? What was going to happen between Jason and me? Could I really keep pretending nothing was going on, or would we eventually have to confront this thing between us? The thought of telling Paul crossed my mind, but I quickly pushed it away. I couldn't imagine telling him the truth. It was too complicated, too messy. What would he say? How would he look at me? How could I explain something I couldn't even understand myself? I tried to sleep, but the weight of everything kept me awake. It wasn't just Jason's words, though they echoed in my mind. It was the way he made me feel. The way he looked at me, like he saw me in a way no one else ever had. And the worst part? I didn't know if I wanted to stop feeling it. The next morning, I woke up feeling strangely calm. It was like the weight of the night before had somehow lifted, even though the tension between Jason and me was still there, hovering just beneath the surface. I got up, made some coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table, trying to clear my mind. I had to focus. I couldn't let myself get lost in this, whatever it was. But when Jason walked into the kitchen, everything shifted again. He smiled at me, and even though it was small, it felt like it meant everything. There was a certain warmth in his eyes that made my heart flutter. It wasn't just the smile. It was the way he was looking at me, like I was the only person in the room. Like I was the only person he cared about. "Morning," he said, his voice quiet, like he didn't want to break the peace that had settled between us. I smiled back, unsure of how to respond. "Morning." We sat in silence for a few minutes, just drinking our coffee. It felt nice. Like maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. Maybe we could keep pretending. Maybe we could just go on like this. But I knew it wouldn't last. The moment I started to relax, I could feel it. The tension was still there, just waiting to snap. "So, what do you think? Do you think Jason and Sarah should just give in to their feelings, or should they keep fighting the urge to get closer? It seems like every time they get near each other, the tension only grows. But does that mean they should take the next step? Or is it better to walk away and pretend nothing's changed? Let me know what you think in the comments. Should Sarah follow her heart, or is Jason just a complication she needs to get over? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And of course, if you're enjoying the twists and turns of this story, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss out on the rest of Sarah's journey. You won't believe what happens next. The days continued to blur together. I had moments when everything felt like it was back to normal, Paul going off to work, Jason doing his usual routine, and me taking care of everything at home. But no matter how much I tried to keep things routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Every time Jason and I locked eyes, it was like there was an unspoken understanding between us. A silent question in the air that neither of us was ready to answer, but it was there. And even though we didn't talk about it, I felt it growing, creeping into every moment we spent together. One afternoon, Paul asked me to run some errands while he was at work. Jason was home, and I knew he'd be around. As I got in the car to leave, I glanced back at the house, my heart racing. I wasn't sure why, but that moment felt important, like something was going to happen. I just couldn't figure out what. I returned to find the house quiet. Paul's car was parked outside, but there was no sign of Jason. I assumed he was just in his room, playing video games or something. But as I stepped into the living room, I found him sitting on the couch, staring at the TV screen without really watching it. His posture was tense, and when he looked up, his eyes seemed to be searching for something I couldn't understand. "Hey, Jason," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Where's your dad?" He didn't respond right away. He just looked at me, and in that moment it felt like time stood still. I felt his gaze pull me in, and it made my heart skip a beat. "He went to his office," he said, his voice a little shaky. I could feel the shift in the air. It was like everything was different. The usual sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, seemed muffled, as if the world outside had faded away. I sat down on the couch a little too close to Jason. I could feel the heat radiating off his body, and it made my heart race even faster. We sat in silence for a while, neither of us knowing exactly what to say. It wasn't until Jason shifted slightly, turning his body toward me, that I realized how close we really were. The space between us felt impossibly small. My breath caught in my throat, and I knew that I had to do something, anything, to break the tension. But I didn't know how. "Jason," I started, but I didn't know what to say next. My mind was spinning, and my words felt trapped inside me. He began, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel, Sarah. Everything's so messed up. I can't stop thinking about you. And I don't know how to make it stop." His confession left me speechless. There was a part of me that wanted to run, to leave before things got worse. But another part of me, one I couldn't deny, wanted to hear more. I needed to know how he felt, even if it scared me. "Jason, you can't," I began to say, but he interrupted me, his hand reaching out to gently touch my arm. "I know," he whispered, his voice full of regret. "I know it's wrong, but I don't want to pretend anymore." The moment felt like it lasted forever, and yet, in an instant, everything changed. I could feel the pull between us growing stronger, impossible to ignore. I didn't know how to respond to him. I didn't know what was the right thing to do. All I knew was that, in that moment, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we were, how much I wanted him to stay. Before I could say anything more, the sound of Paul's car pulling into the driveway interrupted the moment. It was like the world outside had returned, and everything that had been building between Jason and me was suddenly frozen, left hanging in the air. We both pulled away quickly, pretending like nothing had happened. But as I looked at Jason one last time before I stood up, I saw something in his eyes. Something that told me this story wasn't over. Now, here we are. Another day. Another chance for things to go back to normal, or for everything to change forever. Jason and I haven't talked about what happened. Not yet. But I can feel it, the tension still hanging between us, waiting for something to break it. And I know that something is coming. But here's the question. What happens next? Should Sarah let things unfold between her and Jason? Or should she pull back and try to keep everything in her life the way it was before? I'm so curious to hear what you think. Should she give in to her feelings? Or is this a situation she needs to walk away from? Let me know in the comments below. I love reading what you think, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts. And if you're hooked on this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to get the next part of this wild journey. There's so much more to come, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. The days that followed were strange. I tried to act like nothing had changed, but deep down, I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. Jason and I were no longer the same two people we had been before that moment. Everything had shifted, and the tension between us was like a thick fog that wouldn't lift, no matter how hard we tried. I caught myself looking at him more often than I should. I'd find myself thinking about the way his voice sounded when he spoke to me, the way his eyes followed me when I moved across the room. It was hard to ignore. He had always been my stepson, but now I saw him differently. And it scared me. Jason, for his part, was just as quiet as I was. We never talked about what happened between us, about the confession he made, or the way we almost let ourselves fall into something we couldn't take back. But I could see it in his eyes. I could see that he was struggling just like me. It wasn't just about the attraction, it was about everything. It was about the mess of emotions that had suddenly appeared, like an unexpected storm, and neither of us knew how to ride it out. One evening, after Paul had gone to bed, I found myself alone in the living room. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I was sitting on the couch, staring at the empty space across from me, lost in my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't understand, something I couldn't control. Suddenly, the door opened, and Jason stepped inside. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. I don't know how to do this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face him, my heart thudding in my chest. Do what? I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew the answer.
This.
All of this, Jason said, his voice shaky. I don't know how to act around you anymore. I don't know what's right and what's wrong, and I don't know if I should just ignore everything, or if I should just tell you what I'm really feeling. I could see the struggle in his eyes. He was torn just like me. Neither of us knew what to do with these feelings, but they were there, making everything so much more complicated than it had ever been. I don't know either, I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. I wish I could just pretend it didn't happen. I wish I could go back to the way things were. Jason took a step closer, and I could feel the air around us change again. It was like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But I didn't want to make the first move. I was too afraid. I was afraid of what would happen if we crossed that line. But at the same time, I couldn't deny that I wanted to know what would happen. My heart raced, and I could hear my own breathing, quick and uneven. I don't want to hurt you, Sarah, Jason said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. I don't want to make things worse, but I can't keep pretending that I don't care about you. I felt something inside me break. I knew exactly what he meant. The weight of everything, of the guilt, the confusion, the desire, was starting to feel too much for me to bear alone. I wanted to tell him to stop, to just walk away, to leave everything behind. But instead, I stayed silent. For a moment, we stood there, both unsure of what to do. I wanted to say something, anything, to make things better, but nothing came out. Instead, I simply nodded, unsure if I was agreeing to something or if I was just giving up the fight. I don't know what's going to happen next, I said softly, but I can't keep pretending like nothing's changed. We need to figure this out. Jason's eyes softened, and for a moment, he stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. His touch was gentle, reassuring, like he was trying to tell me that everything would be okay, even though we both knew it wouldn't be. I'm sorry, Jason whispered, almost as if he was apologizing for everything. I don't want to hurt you. I stopped him with a soft shake of my head. You're not hurting me, I said, my voice thick with emotion. We're both just trying to figure this out. I don't know where it's going, but I can't pretend it's not there anymore. The truth was, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what Jason and I were building, but I couldn't ignore the way my heart was pulling me toward him. And I couldn't deny that, in some way, I wanted to let it happen. But at the same time, I was terrified of what it would mean. I was afraid of how this might change everything, how it could ruin everything I had worked so hard to build. We both sat down on the couch, sitting side by side, but not quite touching. The space between us felt like a chasm, and yet it also felt too small. It was like we were both trying to keep our distance, but every moment we spent together seemed to draw us closer. Do you think we can ever go back? Jason asked quietly, his voice almost pleading. Back to how things were before? I looked at him, searching his eyes for an answer. But the truth was I didn't know. I didn't know if we could ever go back to the way things were. I didn't know if it was even possible. No, I whispered. I don't think we can. Jason nodded, as if he already knew. As if he had known all along. But that didn't stop the ache in my chest. We were both stuck in a place we didn't know how to escape from. And even though we both had feelings for each other, neither of us knew what to do with them. I could feel the weight of everything between us, and I knew that the decision would eventually have to be made. But for now, we sat there together, both too afraid to move, both too afraid to speak the words that would change everything. I've been thinking about everything that happened, trying to make sense of it. There's so much we don't understand, and the feelings we have for each other are so complicated. It's not just about attraction, it's about something deeper, something more intense. But should we give in to these feelings, or should we just walk away before it gets any worse? I'm not sure what the right choice is, but I know one thing. Things can never be the same again. So, what do you think? Should Sarah and Jason take a chance on their feelings, or should they let go before it's too late? I want to hear your thoughts. And if you want to see what happens next, make sure you like this video and subscribe. You won't want to miss the next chapter in this story. The silence between Jason and I was thick, like a blanket we couldn't escape. It wasn't just about the tension anymore, it was everything. The way we looked at each other, the things we didn't say, the space we shared. It all felt so wrong, yet at the same time, it felt like something we couldn't avoid. I wanted to break the silence, to tell him that I was scared of what we were doing to each other, scared of where this was going. But every time I tried to speak, the words got stuck in my throat. How could I even begin to explain the mess inside me? The confusion, the fear, the desire, all tangled together. Sarah, Jason whispered, his voice barely audible, but full of emotion. What are we doing? His question hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt like I was drowning in it. What were we doing? I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know if I wanted to know the answer. I could see in Jason's eyes that he was waiting for me to say something, but I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that I was standing on the edge of something that could change everything. And part of me wanted to jump, to see where it would lead, while the other part was too afraid to even move. I don't know. I finally managed to whisper back. I don't know what we're doing, Jason. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. There was no way to turn back now. The question was, what would happen next? What was I willing to risk? As Jason stood there, looking at me with those eyes filled with questions and uncertainty, I realized something. We were both standing at a crossroads. Our next move could change everything. We could walk away, pretend like none of this had ever happened. Or we could lean into this feeling and see where it took us. But neither of us knew what the right choice was. And that's where I left it. For now. So, what do you think? Should Sarah take the leap and risk everything, or should she walk away and try to forget the feelings she has for Jason? I know it's a tough choice. I can't even decide for myself. But here's what I know for sure. There's more to this story, and I'm not ready to let it go yet. Neither is Jason. So stay tuned, because things are only going to get more complicated from here. And you don't want to miss what's coming next. If you want to find out what happens, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. I need to know what you think. What should Sarah do next? Tell me in the comments below, and let's talk about it. And just when you think you've figured it all out, there's one thing that's about to change everything. One choice. One moment. And it could destroy everything I've worked for, or bring us closer than we've ever been. I'll see you in the next video, where things get even more intense. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.